On today's episode of What's Going On with Shipping, Hurricane Milton targets Tampa. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. This is marine traffic showing the exodus out of the port of Tampa yesterday in preparation for the arrival of a Category 5 hurricane that is Milton. Now, it's expected it will weaken as it gets closer to West Florida. However, right now, all the track lines have it converging on the port of Tampa. This means a potential storm surge of 10 to 15 feet. So ships are exiting the port, clearing the harbor. This has been ordered by the U.S. Coast Guard. Ship pilots started taking the vessels out. These include cargo ships, cruise lines, and tankers, which are just topping off the tanks there in Central Florida. We're going to be taking a look at the impact this hurricane is going to have on Central Florida regarding the ports. What is available in Central Florida in terms of food and fuel, what ships can come in after the hurricane, what impact the closure of a major U.S. port will have on exports and imports, and what can be done to help mitigate the impact of this hurricane. Right now, the estimates are about 1 million people are going to be without power. Duke Energy has mobilized 10,000 people on standby. We have the closure of oil and natural gas platforms out in the Gulf of Mexico. Ships are evading right now to get out of the way of this hurricane. However, ships are going to be prepared to come back into Tampa to help provide relief and stores and fuel supplies as needed. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to be alerted about new videos as they come out. So let's go back to marine traffic. This is the track for Milton. Milton is sitting there just north of Yucatan. It is going to grab power as it cuts across the Straits of Yucatan. This is all warm water coming up between the Yucatan Peninsula and Cuba. It is just going to empower this hurricane even more, gather it up to full Cat 5. However, as it starts progressing toward Florida, they expect it to start losing some power, maybe dropping to a Cat 4, potentially a Cat 3. However, that's not going to stop the storm surge. Every track line from the National Hurricane Center and all of them have them converging on the port of Tampa, and that is right here. It is then going to kind of bifurcate the peninsula, cut across, head out into the Atlantic, and continue almost eastward. It's being pushed down by a massive high that's sitting up here off the southeastern part of the United States and going to push it out to sea. This is going to have a massive impact on the ability to get ships in and out of Tampa. And one of the things you'll hear all the time in hurricanes is the need for fuel, gasoline and diesel, and particularly for generators and for distribution. This chart put out by the EIA, this is the Energy Information Agency, part of the Department of Energy, shows you how fuel is distributed in and around Florida. Florida does not have a pipeline system akin to the Colonial Pipeline system that pumps fuel into the central part of Florida. Instead, fuel comes in by ships, either by tankers or tugs and barges. And in particularly, the port of Tampa is a major receiver of fuel coming in from Texas and Louisiana. Fuel comes into Tampa, and then there's a series of pipelines, the Central Florida Pipeline, and that fuel, which comes into Tampa, distributes itself all up along the west coast of Florida into the central coast of Florida to Orlando. So if Tampa is not receiving fuel, that is going to be a major factor here. East coast of Florida, same thing, into Port Everglades, up into Port Canaveral, up into Jacksonville. This is where fuel comes in on the eastern side of Florida. The only pipelines are in the very northern panhandle area, but that is outside the reach of this storm. The peninsula of Florida is going to need to require to be able to bring fuel in. So one of the cries you'll hear either before, during, or after this hurricane is going to be to waive the Jones Act. The Jones Act is the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. It is a law that was passed to establish the nation's first national maritime strategy. It was an all-encompassing law, but the provision that is going to be cited here is Section 27. Section 27 deals with the fact that to move goods between U.S. ports, U.S. goods between other U.S. ports, you have to do this on a U.S.-owned, U.S.-flagged, U.S.-built, and U.S.-crewed vessel. There is always an issue following storms like this to waive the Jones Act to allow foreign ships to pick up cargo in U.S. ports and move it down into the area. However, in terms of fuel and transportation for this region, particularly Tampa, it's not really going to be applicable. You'll still hear it, don't get me wrong, but it's not going to be applicable because there is a dedicated force and fleet of ships that does this. So these are large deep draft vessels in the U.S. fleet that are operating in and around the area. In particularly here, I want to show you several vessels here that have just left. Three of them in particular. Here you have the Golden State, the Garden State, and the Overseas Tampa. Golden State here is on a hurricane diversion. Garden State has its destination listed as Tampa. The ship sailed, not completely offloaded. Unfortunately, the terminal didn't offload it fast enough, so the ship left with fuel on board. And then you have a ship like the Pelican State here that's waiting to come in behind Hurricane Milton and offload fuel. Same time, you have fuel being offloaded here in Port Everglades. So the thing about the Jones Act is, yes, it restricts the type of vessels that can come into U.S. ports, but it also provides a dedicated fleet of vessels to come into U.S. ports and drop off fuel. And right now what we know is the fuel tanks in Tampa have been topped off. Each of those tankers carry about 50,000 tons of fuel. That is about 1.6 million gallons a piece, those tankers, and we just had 4 of them in there with more scheduled to come in. So this is the tank facilities in the Port of Tampa. This is Kinder Morgan facility right here. Here is Transmontane facility up here. We just saw those 3 ships that came in were just right here at these berths. You can see images of ships. These are not the ships. Google Earth takes a snapshot, but those are not actual ships that were there, but they were just in topping off these tanks. Now, there is a bit of a danger, I will tell you, with a 15-foot tidal surge coming into Tampa Bay, that we may get damage to some of these tanks. However, if the tanks are undamaged, tankers can come in behind the storm surge and pump to them. Tankers use their own ship's pumps to pump the tanks. It's basically just a pipeline that they pump into. Those tanks then, in turn, pump into the Central Florida pipeline, which goes all the way to Orlando. The big issue here is going to be there's fuel shortages already in Central Florida. That is not because of a shortage of fuel. It's because of the distribution system. The number of tanker trucks, the ability to pull fuel from the depots and get them out to service stations, gas stations, and distribution centers is going to be limited. Add to it once this storm hits and starts wiping out roads, power lines, it's going to be more difficult. The problem you're going to have in Central Florida is going to be you're going to have a lot of fuel at the port. The problem is getting it out of the port into the central area for distribution. That is always a problem. We've seen this happen multiple times. Puerto Rico, the very last hurricanes, was the same way. We had plenty of fuel in the port of San Juan, just couldn't get it out of the port of San Juan to other regions. And the issue here is going to be internal and then along the coast here. And that is why you're going to need vessels potentially to be able to deploy cargo off the coast. So you're hearing about a lot of preparation in the state of Florida, which is excellent. We've seen good responses from a state that's been hit by hurricanes repeatedly. We just had Hurricane Helena come through, and so we've already seen the response. However, on the federal level, one of the responses that should be kicked off almost immediately, because you don't want to wait for this hurricane to hit to do it, is start positioning naval units off the coast to help. Some of those units could be naval vessels, amphibious vessels with helicopter support that will help you land material up and down the coast. Some of it can be amphibious vessels to help land cargo over the beach, which is going to be needed. You can move Army watercraft into the area. They're stationed down at Fort Eustis. Unfortunately, some of those watercraft are still over in the Mediterranean because of the Gaza Pier. But the other vessel that can be moved is the newest, what's called National Security Multi-Mission Vessel. This is the first of 5 vessels being built for this specific reason. One of them is in service. It is the training ship for the State University of New York Maritime College up in the Bronx. That vessel can be activated and moved into the area. However, you need to start moving these assets sooner rather than later. You don't want to wait until after the hurricane hits and then you start moving assets into place. That is a problem, in my opinion. We wait too long to start mobilizing assets. Naval, Army, and Maritime Administration assets should be activated early and start moving. Let's take a minute and look at the Port of Tampa Bay. Now, Port of Tampa Bay is not the largest port in the United States. It's not even ranked kind of in the top 20 ports. It's not a huge port. But what it is a very much well-rounded port. It does a little bit of everything. It does containers. It does bulk cargo. It does fuel. It does passengers. It does everything. But the biggest thing for the Port of Tampa is its exports of fertilizer. It's one of the main exporters of fertilizer, not just in the United States, but in the world. And if this port gets destroyed and shut down, and if the loading facilities is damaged, that's going to have a big hit on the economy. I will link you over to the Port of Tampa Bay and their website. They have some great information on here that allows you to really delve into what the port does. So one of the big things is the cruise ship terminal. Cruise ships are scheduled in and out of this port all the time. Right now, we just saw the sailing of the Islander. This is one of the Margarita at Sea vessels. It just sailed from the port. The Carnival Cruise Line Paradise is scheduled in the port on Thursday. Royal Caribbean Serenade on Friday. The Enchantment and Grandeur. And again, we come back with the Islander. I want to come back to the issue of cruise lines for a second. These ships can be crucial during a disaster that we're about to see unfold in Tampa. Think about this for a second. These ships are not going to be able to load passengers. You're not going to be able to fly into Tampa. You're not going to be able to get in and out of Tampa. So these ships are not going to be able to do their scheduled runs. However, these ships are self-contained little cities. They have power. They have rooms. They have hygiene facilities. They have cooking facilities. These are perfect areas to bring into the port to provide relief areas for people to come to get rehabbed, to shelter in place for a period of time until things can be fixed. We should be thinking about a plan whereby if cruise ships are operating in and out of U.S. ports, especially in the Port of Tampa here, that we can call upon these ships, which are going to be losing their business anyway, to come in and provide shelter and aid for people. This is the perfect kind of shelter in place area. You're going to have to replenish these vessels, so these ships are going to have to sail and go, or you're going to have to bring food by barge into the area, which can be done. We should be thinking about pressing these cruise lines into service as relief areas for personnel who are going to be in this area, maybe displaced. You don't have to live on it for a long period of time, but you at least go on board, get a meal, get a shower, and do a quick turnover and provide some assistance. Again, cruise ships derive a lot of wealth from coming in and out of U.S. ports. Their companies are based in the United States, yet their corporations are offshore. They don't pay U.S. taxes, except for the people who are there employed in the U.S. If you're going to take advantage of the U.S., then hey, let's go ahead and see what we can do to use these ships. While Port of Tampa is not one of the largest ports in the United States, it has a sizable presence. It runs a series of lines that are connecting Tampa to Asia. So, for example, a series of lines sailing from Tampa connect them to Shanghai, Ningbo, Xianmen, Yantian, and Busan. They are serviced by major companies: Costco, CMA CGM, OCL, Evergreen, Zim, MSC, Mediterranean Shipping, and Maersk Lines. We also see some local routes, one down to Costa Rica, the Linnea Peninsula route. We see the Dole Ocean Express that operates along the Gulf Coast, and then the Central American route operated by Maersk down to the Panama Canal for transshipment. So a lot of containers, a lot of movement of cargo in and out of Tampa. When Tampa shuts, and it's going to shut, The fear is the container terminals, a lot of the cargo handling terminals are going to be damaged. And so normally scheduled routes coming in there are going to have to be either delayed or rerouted to other areas. Now, a lot of the containers will be rerouted into other areas. The problem is going to be you're not going to be able to get those containers into southern Florida. One of the key things on the Gulf and East Coast of the United States, the most recent port strike, is that we operate smaller ports in those regions so that you can deliver cargo more direct to the consumers. If you've ever driven the state of Florida, you know how long the state of Florida is to drive from Miami all the way up to the Georgia border or over to Tallahassee. It's going to be really difficult to get those containers in, so the loss of these routes are going to be a major issue. So in terms of tonnage for 2023, in terms of dry bulk, it moved 10.7 million tons of cargo. The largest commodities coming out here: rock, phosphate, charcoal, 3.7 million, followed by limestone, almost 2 million, and then cement, about 1.4 million. So a massive bulk facility that is the Port of Tampa. And then you have liquid bulk. You're talking about 22.4 million tons. Largest of that is 18 million tons petroleum products coming out, 2 million tons of sulfuric liquid coming out, and then almost 1 million tons of ammonia hydrogenous and concentrate citrus juice. One of the things we see come out of Florida, obviously, is citrus. This is state of Florida. You're talking about grapefruits and oranges, but you're also talking about a key commodity, which is fertilizer. We're going to come back to that. In terms of general cargo, about 1.9 million. Large portion of that is containerized, but also scrap metal. In terms of vessels, 3,103 ship calls last year into the port of Tampa. It moved 217,000 TEUs. Those are 20-foot equivalent units. Moved 1.1 million passengers. Total number of cruise sailings, 249 out of Tampa. Let's go over to OEC. This is a database that tracks shipments in and out of port. So in the port of June, trade out of Tampa, $151 million in exports, $479 million of imports. When you look at 2023, Tampa exported $2.7 billion, making it the 89th largest exporter out of 385 exporters. The key exports were fertilizer with nitrogen and phosphorus, followed by a whole batch of other chemicals I am not even going to try. In terms of imports, it imported $4.43 billion, the largest imports into Tampa: fixed-wing aircraft, trucks, small-size cars. Not surprising with Florida coming in there. So what's a top destination for exports out of the port of Tampa? It's going to be Brazil. The fastest growing export destinations: Turkey, Costa Rica, and Malaysia. And the ones that are in decline are Brazil, Mexico, and India. In terms of imports, top import is going to be from Mexico. So a Category 5 hurricane heading for the port of Tampa could be catastrophic. This is going to be a substantial damage. One of the key things is going to be what damage does the port sustain. A 10 to 15 foot storm surge has the potential to cause havoc in the port. We could see the loss of cranes. We can see the loss of shore facilities. We can see the loss of warehousing. We could see the damage to fuel facilities. That is going to be key. If all of a sudden you lose the key fuel facilities ashore, that is the fuel facility that handles the pipeline over into Central Florida, over to Orlando. That is the pipeline that gets fuel to the airports in the area. You're not going to have fuel for airports. That's going to mean planes are going to have to come in with enough fuel to get back out of airports. All of this is really crucial. Florida is a massive peninsula. We need to be thinking about the maritime dimension here to provide aid to everybody in Florida. The population of Florida basically rings the peninsula, except for those inland areas in and around Orlando, which are going to be hit severely. This storm, besides going into the port of Tampa, is going to go right over Orlando. and it has the potential to cause widespread flooding and damage. Remember, we just had flooding and damage by a previous hurricane. There was a storm just in Florida prior to this, so you're dealing with a soaked environment already, and now you're talking about adding more rain and energy into this area. It's going to be devastating. The key thing here is one of the things that the Jones Act fleet does. It provides dedicated ships to come in here. There are ships operating on the East Coast going down to Puerto Rico. There are ships on the West Coast shuttling fuel between the two areas. There can be alert of activating of ships from the Ready Reserve Force if needed. Those ships can be waived from their Jones Act requirements to start moving cargo in. I think you need to start thinking about mobilizing assets as soon as possible. The National Multi-Mission Security Vessel that's up in New York, the Empire State, Navy vessels, amphibious vessels, in particularly Army watercraft, Maritime Administration reserve vessels, tugs and barges. There's going to be an all-hands evolution that's going to be needed in the state of Florida. I'm not trying to alarm people, but a lot of this preparations need to be done beforehand. You don't want to send ships after the storm hits because it takes time. Ships do not move as quickly as aviation assets. You need to start positioning them, getting them ready to go beforehand. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You hit the super thanks button down below or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly and yearly subscriber. To everybody in Central Florida, if you have not taken shelter yet on the west coast of Florida, do so now. Do not wait. Mayor of Tampa is saying that this will kill you is not lying. This is an atrocious storm. Get away from it. You will not fight water. Water doesn't care about you. Water just wants to kill you. You need to get away from it. Seek shelter. Get as far away from the coast as you can. Head north, head south, do whatever you can, but get out of there. And you can always come back and find your belongings later. The thing you cannot replace is life. Thanks for tuning in. Until our next episode, this is Sal, signing off.